Welcome to today's lecture on Apatheism by Trevor Hedberg. My name's Brandon Jones. I'm the president of the UTC Philosophy Club. Hope everyone's doing well today. So, when it comes to the question of whether or not we should care about God's existence, I always sort of think about this short anecdote from Sartre's novel, Nausea. I'm going to read that to you real quick. In 1787, at an inn near Malines, an old man was dying, a friend of Diderot, trained by the philosophers. The priests of the neighborhood were nonplussed. They had tried everything in vain. The good man would have no last rites. He was a pantheist. The Marquis de Rollebon, who was passing by and who believed in nothing, bet the curé of Moulins that he would need less than 2 hours to bring the sick man back to Christian sentiments. The curé took the bet and lost. Rollebon began at 3 a.m. The sick man confessed it at 5 and died at 7. "Are you so forceful in argument?" asked the curé. "You outdo even us." "I did not argue," answered the Marquis de Rollebon. "I made him fear hell." And so I often wonder where exactly our concern for God or God's non-existence may or may not lie. And that's why I'm very excited to have Trevor with us today from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, our sister school. So I hope you'll join me in a round of applause to welcome him.
Thanks for the introduction, Rudy. So first thing, this is a bigger room than I often do these talks in. So those of you in the back, can you hear me okay? All right, take your thumbs up as an affirmative on that. So a couple acknowledgments before we get underway and while Dr. Barrow is distributing the handouts. I want to thank Brandon for taking some initiative and filling out the forms and notifying me about this opportunity. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here. I also want to thank Dr. Rivero for facilitating the process as well. I also want to thank all of you for taking some time out of your Wednesday afternoon to come and listen to this talk. And last, I want to thank a good friend of mine, whom none of you know, but his name's Jordan Huzervich. He has been a good friend and co-author on a paper in progress that is the basis for this talk, and I have had many exchanges with him that have led to kind of the ideas that you're going to be privy to today. So here's a question to get things started. How many of you have ever heard of apatheism prior to seeing the title of this talk or a flyer or me just mention it right now? Wow, like 2 of you. That's actually more, or maybe 3. That's more than I was expecting. When I rehearsed this presentation a few days ago, it was just a flat 0 out of the 20-ish students in attendance. So now, for those of you who have never heard of it, you shouldn't feel bad. It is an extremely underused term, and as we'll see, it's basically a blind spot in the philosophical literature. So here's the overview, roughly, for what I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background about what apatheism is, why it's important, and why this particular view merits attention. After that, I'm going to try to clarify exactly what apatheism is, because as I sort of alluded to a moment ago, there really isn't a lot of literature on the topic. It's really underexplored. And so the first thing we need to do is pin down exactly what it is and how we should conceive of it. After that, I'm going to articulate 2 arguments. They're not going to be proofs per se, but they're going to be kind of like argumentative stories that one could tell to try to vindicate an apatheist position with respect to God's existence. So the general apathetic attitude that characterizes apatheism, how exactly would you defend that position philosophically? It may be true that there are tons of people who just, as a matter of fact, don't care about God's existence or religion or spirituality or what have you. But the real question I'm interested in is, how would someone defend that position philosophically? What argument could they give, or arguments could they give, to defend that kind of view? And then the majority of the presentation will focus in on these 2 argumentative sketches. But once we get done with that, I'll try to draw some conclusions and think about where further philosophical explorations of apatheism might go. So here's a little bit of background. Whereas many of you have probably not heard of apatheism before, a lot of people have heard of these so-called new atheists, particularly the Four Horsemen, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. Now, atheism is not a new position. It's been around for thousands of years, has a long and rich philosophical history. But the new atheists have made their presence felt by their particularly hostile and uncompromising attacks on religion and theistic belief more generally. They've drawn a lot of attention to what I'm going to call existence questions. Now, I don't mean here existence broadly construed. I mean a very particular type, cluster of questions related to existence, namely questions related to the existence of God. So those of you who have taken philosophy or religion courses before have probably encountered several of them before. For example, the most basic one, does God exist? Another closely related one, can we know that God exists? And then a more epistemological question, what would count as evidence for God's existence? And you can keep coming up with examples. There are many, many permutations of these kinds of questions. So the real issue here that I want to consider is, could apathy about the answers to existence questions be a justifiable attitude? Now, what's interesting is there's a shared assumption by the new atheists and their interlocutors. And the shared assumption is these debates are really important. What the answers to these existence questions are is a really crucial matter, and it's really vital that we get the right answers, whatever they may be. What's interesting is, because this is a shared assumption, it seems open to question whether or not that assumption is ultimately justified. So there's a sense in which this is just radically counterintuitive, right? So questions about God's existence have been central not just to philosophy of religion, but to the history of philosophy more generally. Almost every big-name philosopher in history has at some point had something to say about religion, the existence of God, and so on. So certainly, if you haven't really thought about it carefully, I think the default position is, of course these matters are really, really important. But that's precisely the thing that I want to challenge today, or at least think about how one might go about challenging them. And it's important to take that challenge seriously because there are some important things that would come about if this view, that namely a general attitude of apathy about the answers to existence questions, if this wound up being the correct view, there would be some important implications. One would be that the new atheists and their critics are just going about this matter in the entirely the wrong way. There is no need for such hostility, high-stakes exchanges, and so on, because this stuff really isn't that crucially important. But the other thing that might follow is that maybe existence questions aren't the be-all and end-all in philosophy of religion that we thought they were. Maybe there are other issues that are more worthy of philosophical attention. And the last one is a general attitude of apathy or indifference towards existence questions, if this assumption is false, would then be justified. So apatheism would be the correct view. That would be a proper way to look at these debates and to think about them. Okay, so I've thrown the term around a bunch, but now we have to actually figure out what the hell it means. What exactly is apatheism? Normally, what one does when you hear like a technical term like this is you consult the philosophical literature and try to see how have people gone about defining it in the past. The problem is there's basically no philosophical literature where this term is mentioned explicitly. If you do a search on Phil Papers, which is a giant database, and you don't have to have any special library access or anything, it's a giant database of philosophy papers maintained by professional philosophers, and you type in apatheism, you're going to get a total of one result. 2008 conference proceedings. It was like a little 2,000-word write-up, and it's not even published in a peer-reviewed journal. If you do the same search on Philosopher's Index, which you probably have access to through UT libraries, you're going to get 0 results. It will reroute you to atheism because it'll think that's what you meant. So, can appeal to the literature, and often if you look at classifications of believers and non-believers, so if you look at a chart that has, atheist, theist, agnostic, breaks down all the theists and all the different religions and so on, you're almost never going to see a label attached to apatheism. So you can't even really get a sense of it from looking at, from just your standard Google search. And if you dig deeper, you might find the occasional bumper sticker or clever aphorism, say, or a spoof demotivating poster if you use Google Images. But again, you're just going to find a bunch of varying uses and definitions, and obviously this isn't backed up by any rigorous scholarship. The only consistent feature that seems to emerge is that it's tied in some way to a general attitude of apathy or indifference about God or religion or spirituality or all of the above or some combination of that. So here's what I take to be sort of an ordinary definition that one might have. And I've seen this show up on blogs and other places online. I think this is the wrong definition, but this is one definition that a person could have. They could identify it as a type of non-belief in God that's based on an attitude of apathy or indifference. Now, the reason why I've bolded the type of non-belief is that this is different than certain other definitions. So Jonathan Rauch, who to my knowledge has actually given the most substantive analysis of this term, which is saying something because it's a magazine article in The Atlantic from 2003. This is not like a peer-reviewed journal article or a book chapter or anything like that. He defines apatheism as an indifferent or apathetic attitude with respect to religion. So in his own words, it is a disinclination to care all that much about one's own religion, and an even stronger disinclination to care about other people's. And it's worth noting that on Rauch's definition, it's not just limited to being a type of non-belief. This could apply to you regardless of whether you believe in God or not. Now here's a third definition that comes from Walter Sennett Armstrong, who is in fact a professional philosopher at Duke University. Now this is from the preface of his book, Morality Without God. This is like where he's giving an autobiographical sketch of himself. This is all he says about it in the entire book, one short little paragraph. Here's what it says. After he describes himself as being an atheist, he says, "I am also a relative apatheist, because I am usually apathetic about whether or not God exists. I do not spend my days worrying about God, either the traditional Christian God, or Zeus, Thor, Krishna, or Allah, any more than I spend my days worrying about ghosts, elves, leprechauns, Nessie, or Bigfoot, or even advanced species on other planets." So here again, this is a different definition, because Sennett Armstrong is tying it to how you answer the question of whether or not God exists, right? So he's tying it explicitly to an existence question, whereas the previous definition from Jonathan Rauch tied it to religion. So these are at least three different competing definitions. How do we make sense of them? My proposal is that Sennett Armstrong is broadly correct, that apatheism should properly be identified as being tied to existence questions in an important way. And one of the main reasons that motivates me thinking this way is this is how we demarcate other classes of believers and non-believers. So, really basic existence question. Does God exist? There's two obvious answers you could give. You could answer yes, in which case you're a theist. Or you could answer no, in which case you're an atheist. Another existence question, can we know whether or not God exists? And if you answer that question yes, then you are a Gnostic. You think, sure, we can have knowledge of that sort of thing. If you answer no, then you're an agnostic. You think, no, we actually can't have knowledge about these matters. So what I want to propose is we formulate a similar existence question, or at least something symmetrical to it, with respect to apatheism. So here's the question. Should we care about God's existence? Now, the orthodox view seems to be yes, like, of course, it's super important. I don't have a label for that, so orthodox view, this is not like what you would find. I'm just not sure what to call it. Non-apatheism, that sounds kind of silly. But if you answer the question no, then you're an atheist. So on this definition, apatheism is the view that one ought not to care much about how we answer existence questions. I also want to make one point of clarification, which is made more explicit on the handout. This is a normative definition of apatheism, as opposed to just a description. So we could define apatheism as just a description. We could use it to just identify people who, as a matter of fact, don't care about whether or not God exists. But what I want to consider is whether we can make a stronger construal of it work. So this normative definition makes a claim about what we should think about existence questions, what attitude we should have. It's not just a claim about what attitude certain people in fact have. So here's one way you might try to cash out the definition. You could try to define it in a very strong way that doesn't admit of exceptions. So you might say, apatheism is the view that everyone should be apathetic about how they and others answer existence questions. Unfortunately, I don't think this definition is going to work because it's too inflexible. It does not allow for any exceptions. So suppose that you are a professor who is trying to get tenure, and you have a research project related to, say, an ontological argument for the existence of God, or a problem of evil argument, or something like that. Seems like you have a very strong reason to care about how you're working out your answer to this existence question, because getting published is going to give you a better chance of getting tenure. So that's a very clear practical reason. Similarly, if you were, say, thinking about becoming a minister or a preacher, if you were not really confident that God existed, then you might later in life, if you came to think in fact it doesn't exist, feel like your life had been wasted, or you had made a serious mistake early on. So again, that looks like a very practical reason to care about existence questions, at least in those particular contexts. And you can probably come up with many other specific examples. So a view that doesn't allow for any exceptions looks like it's just too strong. So here's the more sort of philosophical lingo definition that I want to push. Apatheism is the view that prima facie one should be apathetic about how she and others answer existence questions. Now, what's the difference between the two definitions? Well, basically, we've added in the phrase prima facie. And that's a Latin term roughly meaning on first encounter or on initial appearance. In this context, you could read the definition as saying the default attitude that one should adopt about existence questions is one of apathy or indifference. But there might be exceptions. So someone might be able to give you a really good justifying reason why for them, in their particular circumstances, it makes sense for them to think existence questions are important. But I want to point out again that even this slightly more lenient view is clearly rejected by the new atheists, their critics, and the vast majority of contemporary philosophy in these areas. So it's not like this makes the view that we're trying to examine any more trivial or anything like that. And here's the real philosophical question. So that's all just terminological clarification. The real question is, how could you defend this kind of view? So if you encountered an atheist on the street and you said to this person, look, let's be realistic, your view is just silly. I mean, surely whether or not God exists is really important. Come on. What would the apatheist say to you to try to defend his or her position? Or rather, what could they say? So in other words, could they give you an argument that would conclude with the truth of their worldview? So could they give you something like this? A series of premises or statements that logically leads to the conclusion, therefore, prima facie, one should be apathetic about how she and others answer existence questions, or something very similar. So can the atheist give you this kind of picture? Is that possible? Here's one way they might try to do it. So you get into a dialogue with the atheist, and you say, look, your view's just silly. Maybe the apatheist tries to sort of turn it back on you and say, really? Can you give me a reason why existence questions are so important? And then you try to come up with as many reasons as you can, and then the apatheist tries to go through and show that none of these reasons are actually good reasons to think that existence questions are important. So the reason I labeled this the argument from elimination is it sort of proceeds by a process of elimination. So you give a reason, the apatheist tries to refute it. So the interlocutor will say, we should care about existence questions because, and they give a reason. The atheist says, no, you don't know what you're talking about, that doesn't work. Okay, let me try again, here's another reason. Nope, still doesn't work, sorry. And you keep going until eventually you've exhausted all God's existence is of any serious importance. Should be more apathetic about it. Okay, so that's just the sketch. Let's see if we can actually make sense of what that argument would really look like. What reasons could we offer to think that existence questions are really, really important? Well, here's an obvious one. You might think having the right answers to existence questions affects your fate in the afterlife. So, in the spirit of Pascal's famous wager, you might think, well, look, if you don't believe in God and you get it wrong, you might wind up in hell. And that's going to be really bad. On the other hand, if you do believe in God, and in fact, he is around, and you get eternal salvation, that's really, really good. In fact, since presumably these afterlives last forever, could there be anything more important than getting that question right? So how would an atheist respond to this kind of argument, or some kind of similar argument? There are a number of ways. I'm not going to list nearly all of them. But one obvious route, the atheist might just deny the existence of an afterlife, might say it's metaphysically impossible. Might say, like, look, my identity is tied to the upper part of the brain that creates consciousness. When that disappears, I'm gone. It might be possible for God to create a replica of me, maybe, up in heaven, or send my replica to hell, but that person's not going to be me. I'm history. It wouldn't be me any more than if you took, like, a clone of me and then killed the original and said the clone was suddenly me, right? It wouldn't be any different than that kind of case. So I can't actually survive death. That might be one route to go, reject the metaphysics in that way. Another way that they might go is they might say, look, it's not really about existence questions that's going to determine how you fare in the afterlife. It's more about, did you live a good life? Were you a morally good person? So even if Hitler answered all the existence questions right, they might say, surely he's still not going to get rewarded in the long run. Surely he's going to be one of the people that winds up in hell, right? So the real issue here is live a morally good life. It's not really about existence questions at all. Another way they could go is they might be a universalist. So they might hold the theological view that everybody's eventually going to make it to heaven. Everybody does eventually get an invite to that party, even if some people have to do certain things prior to that to repent for their sins and so on. So if they were universalists, they might say something like that. They might even say something really bizarre and counterintuitive, like there's actually no reason to prefer going to any eternally existing afterlife. That sounds kind of crazy in a way, because it would be saying, like, I don't really have any real substantive reason to prefer going to heaven over hell. Now, I want to stress, even though that's crazy, it's been defended. Bernard Williams is the famous historical defender of the view, and there's also someone in the audience who has, I'm not going to point any fingers, but who has defended this position recently in a journal article. And I won't say everything that goes into this argument, but here's the intuition behind it. Imagine doing whatever it is you love doing most in this world. Imagine doing it for 50 million years. Then imagine the second thing, the thing you enjoy doing the second most, all the activities possible. Do it for 50 million years and just repeat the process. And then imagine, okay, after you've done every activity that you can possibly imagine and enjoy, you have an infinite amount of time after that to screw around in the afterlife. So the intuition is, because of the kinds of creatures we are, at some point we're going to get bored. At some point we're going to find an eternally existing afterlife super tedious. And even if there's, on the front end, some enjoyment, eventually it all bottoms out in tediousness and unhappiness. Now, I admit that argument goes by a little bit quick, but again, not trying to prove that this argument is true. I'm just trying to imagine what an atheist could try to say to vindicate his or her position. There are other things that they might say with respect to the afterlife, but I'm going to leave it at those 4 main points for now. So let's suppose that we take them to have adequately dispelled that reason. Well, they're far from done. There are quite a few more we can put on the table. So here's another common one that gets thrown around every once in a while. You might say, look, we gotta have God's got to exist for us to have a satisfactory, objective morality. If God doesn't exist, then everything's permissible, and there's just nothing that we could seriously bind people to in a moral system. There would, in other words, be no objective moral truths about anything. Now, this is an issue where, unlike most of what we've discussed up to this point, there is actually a rough consensus in the philosophical community. The dominant ethical traditions, virtue ethics, Kantianism, utilitarianism, none of those traditions require any connection whatsoever to religion or God. And even some ethical theories that are not as talked about or discussed now, such as like Ross's account of prima facie duties or intuitionism, even those things did not require the existence of God or the truth of a particular religious code to ground an objective ethic. So there's some reason to think that, now I mean it's of course possible that the consensus of the literature is wrong, that in fact we really do still need God to ground objective moral facts. But there is some reason still, even if you thought the consensus was mistaken, there is still some reason to doubt whether a religious theistic ethic would really be the way to go, whether this is really going to solve our problems. Because religion can often be, because religious systems differ in the moral norms that they have, trying to ground a universally acceptable objective ethic on a religious system looks like it may be counterproductive, because you're going to encounter pervasive disagreement. So one may think that a better strategy is to try to appeal to some kind of universal principles that anyone from any particular religious background could accept. Now, if the worry is not so much about objective moral truths, but about like a fear that society will devolve into lawlessness and chaos in the absence of religious ethics, there is some empirical research that suggests otherwise. So the Scandinavian countries, such as Denmark and Sweden, these countries have really, really low crime rates and are pretty thriving communities. They do very well on studies about subjective well-being and things like this, actually much better than nations like the United States that are more religious. And what's striking about it is they are among the least, not only the least religious nations in the world, but maybe the least religious in history. So the worry, if your worry is about the empirical fact that society will devolve and we won't be able to have good moral standards and so on, there's some empirical data that suggests otherwise. The most recent book I know of that I've actually read that addressed this topic was Phil Zuckerman's Society Without God, which was a detailed sociological study of the Scandinavian countries. Okay, here's another reason that the atheist interlocutor might put on the table. Maybe the thought is you want to have the right answers to existence questions because you want to increase your chances of being a recipient of a miracle or of interaction with God. Now, I will confess, of the 6 reasons I'm going to put up here, I find this to be the one that the atheist would have the easiest time refuting. And that's not because you necessarily have to be a skeptic about the occurrence of miracles, although that is one route that you could go, but because even if miracles do occur, it's very obvious that they are extraordinarily rare events. Even the most devout believers often will go an entire lifetime without clearly being a recipient of a miracle, if we understand a miracle as being a divine violation of the laws of nature. And moreover, there are some non-believers who will then later report having been recipients of miracles. So if the thought is you want to maximize your chances of being a recipient of a miracle, there's no obvious reason to think that it's tied to how you answer existence questions. But moreover, you probably shouldn't be living your life trying to maximize your chances of being a recipient of a miracle, because it's pretty damn likely that you're never going to be a recipient of a miracle, no matter what you believe. No one in here is going to go out, deplete your savings account on the assumption that sooner enough God's going to deposit $3,000. He's got your back. Probably not going to happen. Here's a more substantive reason, I think. And I think this is a deep worry for some theists that starts to have doubts about whether or not God exists. One might worry that you got to have God in the background or an afterlife in the background for your life to really have substantive meaning. So here's how, this is an excerpt from William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith. He argues this point midway through that book. Here's what he had to say. Here's how he puts it. If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, then what ultimate meaning can be given to his life? Does it really matter whether he ever existed at all? His life may be important relative to certain other events, but what is the ultimate significance of any of those events? So I take Craig's central thought here to be that if you don't have, if we all really are just going to die at the end of our lives permanently, then how do you give any kind of long-lasting, serious meaning to your existence? Sure, you can influence other people, but what does that really matter? Because again, they're just going to follow the same fate and eventually permanently fade out of existence. Now I confess here that I just don't share Craig's intuition about these kinds of cases. So Craig in the same chapter, actually the very next page, actually says explicitly that doing things like alleviating suffering in the world has no value if God doesn't exist. And I just can't really accept that. Knowing that there are children right now in third world countries that are starving and dying seems to me to be really bad, and it seems to me to be really good to alleviate that suffering, regardless of whether or not, in some background metaphysical picture, God exists or not. And I would encourage you to think about other projects that you might engage in besides like these humanitarian kinds of projects. Just think about, for instance, raising your children. Do you think that the value of raising your children well hinges on whether or not God exists, or whether or not you have an eternally existing afterlife? My inclination is that it would just be really weird, wouldn't it, if you had you just imagine a devout theist who comes to believe God doesn't exist, and then she just suddenly says, oh, well, I guess I don't need to save for my kid's college fund. That was stupid. This would just be a very weird pattern of reasoning, I think. And it goes beyond just that. It can also deal with just your personal projects. Maybe you have a book that you want to finish, or a grade you'd like to get on an exam, or something. It can apply to things that are much more banal. I don't think that the meaning of any of these things, or the way that we should think about them, hinges in a significant way on whether or not in the background God is present. Now, if the worry is you need some kind of religious or spiritual element in your life, or else something's missing, then that's a more moderate point. For some people, that may hold true. But I think it's worth pointing out that at a study conducted recently at this very university, the researchers identified 6 different types of non-believers. And one of the categories that they discovered were ritual atheists and agnostics, who were basically non-believers who still went to church, benefited from spiritual teachings, and did things of this sort. And that seems to me to be a good example of a group of people who see value in these religious and spiritual elements, even though, strictly speaking, they don't accept the metaphysical picture. And I see nothing incoherent about about living that sort of lifestyle, and an atheist might not either. Now, one thing I want to draw attention to as a big picture thing is notice that all 4 of the reasons I've given so far come from the theistic side of the equation. So these are things that most likely a theist is going to say to an atheist to try to convince them that they're mistaken with respect to their attitudes about existence questions. The last 2 are not from the theistic side of the equation. The 5th reason, I think, is more neutral. So the 5th reason focuses on kind of the epistemic value of answering existence questions, especially with regard to certain scientific hypotheses. So you might think, we need to pursue and seriously consider existence questions because we want to know how we came to be. We want to know how the universe came into existence, why we're here. We want to know whether we were designed or whether it was all just sort of a cosmic coincidence. Now, there are 2 things that should be noted about this reason to care about existence questions. One is, there are many scientists, physicists, and so on, who would simply deny it, and who would just say, look, we can build up very elaborate scientific theories for how the universe came into existence and where we come from and so on, without any reference to divine elements whatsoever. So an atheist could go that way, just digging their heels. But I think there's a different kind of response that they could make, which is maybe more effective. And it's just simply saying, like, okay, so remember, my position was that the default attitude is one of apathy or indifference to how we answer existence questions. Now look, if you're a scientist who's working on trying to figure out the origin of the universe, if you've done all got a great education and you're in a position to make a contribution to that debate, sure, maybe you do have a reason to care about existence questions. But that reason's not going to apply to your everyday person walking around on the street. This isn't going to be a reason that's going to generalize. It's going to apply to a very narrow range of people, primarily academics, scientists, and possibly some philosophers who are interested in this particular question. So since it's not going to generalize, this reason doesn't look to be like a really obvious threat to the broadly atheistic position. Here's the last one, and this one comes directly from the New Atheists. So this is how I take a new atheist or someone sympathetic to their views might respond to the broadly atheistic picture. So they might say, religion has really, really bad social effects. It's been the source of tons of suffering and death historically. It encourages people to believe things that are silly and in many cases harmful. We need to seriously examine existence questions because we need to convince people that the answer to the most basic one, does God exist, is negative, so that they will give up their religious beliefs and so that we will then be better off. So Christopher Hitchens has made this point explicitly. And he uses interesting terminology to describe it. So he says, I'm not even an atheist so much as I am an anti-theist. I not only maintain that all religions are versions of the same untruth, but I hold that the influence of churches and the effect of religious belief is positively harmful. So what would an atheist say to Hitchens or someone similarly inclined? What might they say? Well, here, they might simply question the empirical claims. This is one of the standard criticisms of what the New Atheists have put on the table in their books. A lot of people have said, look, you're just radically overestimating the negative effects of religion and radically underestimating the positive effects. So, for example, religion may play a crucial role in moral education, especially in parts of the world where they don't have access to the same kinds of educational opportunities that people in the developed world do. But you may also wonder, somewhat banally, like, is it really the case that intellectual debates about existence questions are going to be the way that we just convince everyone to abandon their socially harmful religious practices? You may be, and given that there are so many philosophical debates that generate hundreds of articles and books, and basically, as far as I can tell, have no profound influence on the world in general. I don't want to diss my own profession, but this is just the truth. There can often be a disconnect between practical implications and what we do at the theoretical level in academic philosophy. So one could be skeptical about that. But I also think that the same response to the previous reason is also open to the atheist here. So you might say, look, Mr. Hitchens, okay, you're like an intellectual superstar. That's fine. You have a lot of say, a lot of clout, a big public image. Maybe you can influence some people with respect to existence questions. And maybe you're even right that there are some socially harmful effects of religion and so on. And maybe you really can make a difference. But I'm just a UT student, doing my thing. I don't think anybody's going to listen to what I have to say. So I don't see why this would be relevant to me. I don't see why this would be a reason for me to care at all about existence questions. It seems like it's only going to apply to a very narrow range of intellectual superstars who have the public image and the potential influence to reach large numbers of people. Okay, so here's the quick and dirty recap of what we just went through. Put up 6 broad reasons, one about the afterlife, one about morality, one about miracles, one about meaning in life, one about origins, and one broadly channeling Christopher Hitchens' anti-theist position. And the thought, if you were trying to defend atheism, is you have argumentative moves that you can make on the atheist's behalf to block every single one of these reasons. Now, no, clearly haven't shown that. You can write entire books about, well, so Walter St. Armstrong did write a book about the morality one. You can definitely write probably multiple books about the afterlife and just on the question of whether or not it's metaphysically possible that there is one, not even touching the other issues that we brought up. And obviously the new atheists have written entire books defending the anti-theism position. So it's not like this is the final say on the matter by any means, but the point is atheists have argumentative moves that they can make. If you're going to play the game with them, they have moves that they can put against you. And so it's odd, given that they have these moves available, it's odd that there is no real discussion of this kind of view. But maybe you're still unconvinced. So maybe even if you were to sort of buy into this argument from elimination thing, you might point out, look, that just shows that the debate at this point would be roughly a stalemate, right? Because what you've shown is that we don't have a great reason for rejecting atheism, but that doesn't obviously show that we have a good reason to endorse it either. So the question then is, would it be possible to craft a different argument that might support atheism directly? So here's a crack at doing exactly that, at trying to craft a supporting argument. And for the first half of this argument, I'm basically borrowing it from a book written by Robert McKim, a professor at University of Illinois at Urbana. The book is called Religious Ambiguity and Religious Diversity. It was written in 2001. The argument builds up over 4 chapters of the book, so this is going to be a very rough sketch of the central points. It starts from a really basic assumption, namely that God is hidden in some capacity. Now, I do not mean that to be taken as God doesn't exist. I just mean if he does exist, his existence is definitely not as obvious as it could be. So God could hold a press conference tomorrow where he predicts the winner of the Super Bowl, which would also be interesting because it might give us some insight into whether he actually has divine foreknowledge or not. But I'm going to bank on the fact that God's not going to do that. But if he did, there would be a lot of non-believers would probably be convinced that they got the question, that they answered that existing question incorrectly, and would come to believe in God. Lots of people, if God's existence was more obvious, would be more open to having a personal relationship with him. There would be fewer religious disagreements, and so on. So the point is, there look to be lots of good things that would be brought about by God revealing himself, on the assumption that he does exist and can do that. Now, let's imagine further that this is exactly the case, that God does exist, and for whatever reason, he's keeping himself hidden. Well, if God is, a lot of theisms assume that God is not just moral, but that he is in fact omnibenevolent, that he's all good. I don't know if you have to necessarily consider it that strongly, but just imagine that God is generally moral. Well, it seems like if God's moral, he's not going to put us in a situation where we're deprived by the circumstances in which we find ourselves from some kinds of goods that are really, really important for our lives to go well. So if in fact we are in jeopardy of suffering in the afterlife if we don't believe in the right God, then the fact that God has kept himself hidden and that we're in this epistemic situation where it's really, really hard to figure out not just whether or not God exists, but also which religion would have the right view, it looks like God's really stacking the deck against us. And there looks to be something morally objectionable about that. So the thought here is, if we really want to say that God's moral, he can't have created circumstances like that. He can't have put us in that kind of position. And so the conclusion is, it must not be the case that having the right answers to existence questions is really, really important for our long-term welfare. Again, operating on the assumption that God does exist. It must not be the case that we need, for example, to have a personal relationship with God to have a really good life. Because if it was, then surely God would have made the world such that it was easier for us to recognize his existence and come to have that sort of relationship. So here's how McKim summarizes the conclusion of this argument in his book. After he presents it, he says, there is then some reason to think that if God exists, it must not matter greatly to God whether we believe. This applies to belief that God exists, to various standard theistic beliefs about God, such as beliefs about the activities and character of God, and to belief in God. If it were very important that we should accept theism, or any particular form of theism, our circumstances probably would be more conducive to it. Now, even if you get on board with all of that, in a way, that only gets us about half the way there, right? Because this is only applying to if God exists. But then one may wonder, well, yeah, okay, so if God exists, an atheistic attitude would be justified. But what if God doesn't exist? You haven't addressed that sort of point. So then an atheist would have to fill in that side of the equation. And in the spirit of their broad view, they might say something like this. If God doesn't exist, then worrying about what the world would be like if he did exist isn't really the best use of our time and energy. What we should really be focusing on doing is trying to live good lives, be good people, etc., in the circumstances we, in fact, find ourselves, independent of any talk about existence questions or worries about those sorts of things. And so if you bridge these two arguments together, you would wind up with conclusion something like, whether or not God exists, the answers to existence questions really aren't that important. And that could conceivably justify a broadly atheistic attitude about these sorts of matters. What the hell does this all mean? Why does any of this matter? I said at the outset that these sketched arguments are very far from providing a proof that atheism is correct. But here's why what I've sketched, I think, is important, or at least so I think. They show that apatheists have something to say on their behalf. So these people that are, that just as a matter of course become apathetic about their answers to existence questions and about religion and religious disagreement and all this other stuff, sure, they may not come to hold those views as a result of considered philosophical reflection. I suspect it's probably more reactionary. It's probably just a recognition of what's happening. They observe like the debates between the new atheists and their critics and just think, like, God, this is just ridiculous. It doesn't seem productive, and so on. And they just think, I don't really want to be a part of that. I don't want to get involved. I would much rather just be kind of indifferent about the whole thing. So it's easy to think, if that's how you come to form the view, that it's not really a philosophically justified position. But the takeaway from what I've been trying to do here is show it's not obviously unjustified. There are things that an atheist could say, substantive philosophical arguments that an atheist could present in his or her defense. And so the central takeaway is that the assumption that underlies so many of these discussions, the assumption that whether we get the right answers to existence questions is really, really important, is an unjustified assumption at this point. There has been a huge discussion, namely the plausibility of atheism as a worldview, that has just been skipped entirely. And skipping that discussion has been premature. Of course, crafting a detailed proof of atheism and considering these arguments in more detail is something that is well beyond me here. That will have to wait for another time. But thank you for your patience, and let's open the floor up for questions.
Okay, you just mentioned that we assume that God's existence is important and we skip apatheism and go straight to talking about existence questions.
That's at least how it usually proceeds.
Wouldn't it be the case that you would have to first establish those existence questions and the nature of God's existence, whether he does or not exist, and then move to apatheism? For example, if we answered the question with a deist answer, and he has no personal involvement, and maybe even with no afterlife, then we could embrace apatheism, that a deist God that has no afterlife and no personal relationship is unimportant. He's just the first cause. So when we first have to establish the nature of God's existence and if he exists before we can, tease with apatheism.
I don't know. I'm not sure that would have to be done. So I think we can ask questions. So the first thing is there is an assumption in the literature that I'll point out that usually it's taken for granted that when they talk of God in the philosophical literature, that it's the omniproperty God, which rules out a deistic God, usually. I don't know if that's another issue as to whether that's a justified starting point or not. I'm just saying that definition is usually sort of taken for granted and assumed. But I think we can talk about like the metaphysics of whether or not an afterlife is possible, independent of answering the question of whether or not God exists. So I mean, now could you do that for every single question? See, I think you can. I mean, you could almost answer it. The way to look at it is you could say, well, let's think about let's posit that God doesn't exist and look at all of the, what the implications would be. And then let's look at if God did exist, what would all the implications be? And for an atheist, they want to say that independent of how that first question shakes out, there's not going to be a lot of practical significance one way or the other. But I don't know if it requires you to actually pin down a determinate answer, like a yes or no question about what God's properties are or whether or not he exists, because you could just examine them as hypothetically, in both instances. Does that make sense?
A little bit, I guess. I guess what I was getting at is your fourth point. It's the premises. The conclusion is apatheism. And in order to establish that conclusion, we have to make sure the premises are true. And these premises deal with certain types of answers to those existence questions. So I think you would have to skip apatheism, and that it has to be an assumption, and that once we establish the nature of God, whatever it may be, existence or not, of how he exists, then we can start to consider its practical, if it's a good thing if we need to believe it.
Yeah, when you said my fourth point, which
from
which
divine
fourth point?
witness to apatheism, that entire category.
So do you mean just for this argument? Just for the hiddenness argument sketched at the end?
Yeah, we could
Is that what you're...
isolate it down to, narrow it down to that.
I'm not sure if I see that, though. If I see it as being necessary to assume at the outset that atheism is false, to run this kind of an argument. Because, I mean, we might have to assume some kind of working definition of God, which is exactly what McKim does.
Well, I didn't mean to say that. I don't know if I did, to assume that it's false. But we haven't said whether or not it's true or false yet. We can't make an informed decision on whether apatheism is true or false yet, because we don't know the nature of God, or if it does indeed or does not exist. I think those questions would have to be answered first before we could consider whether apatheism is a appropriate position to embrace.
Oh, okay. But that's still different than the way things are done, because you're just reserving judgment about atheism, right, on that model. So I don't actually know if we may not actually be disagreeing much here after all. Because yeah, I agree. You couldn't. It would seem to be methodologically inappropriate to also start from the position that atheism was true. I mean, yeah, we got to definitely suspend judgment. As far as figuring out and it does seem that the particular relationship that God has to us, which is exactly what this hiddenness argument, the first part at least, hinges on, does seem crucially important to figuring out in the long run, if the argument's going to go through, whether apatheism is correct. So I guess I don't know if I actually disagree with anything that you've said.
It's fine.
So,
We can move on to other people.
yeah. Either one.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. So I was wondering, as a philosopher, how this impacts your practice. So if you go through it and you're provisionally an activist, does that make philosophy and religion in general, or even working on the question of God, sort of a pointless endeavor? Or another way of asking this question is, one thing I was thinking about at the beginning of your paper is, if one agrees that the answer to the existence question is not important, so agrees with your conclusion, is it important as a working on Apatheism, just because it's interesting and it's sort of fun to do in, as you say, a carefree manner, but it's not relevant, it's not going to impact anybody? Or would you would the logical conclusion as a philosopher be, oh, I realize this is an unimportant subject matter, so I should go work on something that saves starving children or something like that?
Right. So most of what I do is actually in ethics, where I think there is a more direct connection between, like, say, practice and application. But there are tons of philosophers who do stuff in metaphysics and epistemology that the same things I think would hold true. So there's ongoing debates about whether you can actually prove that this is a table, that this is not just a figment of my imagination. That sounds silly, but it's the truth. There are people still carrying on those debates, and that's a classic debate. External world skepticism, right? It's not that silly. I mean,
I'm
it's
sorry.
kind of
No, I'm just in a class with Dr. Bill right now, and that's the very topics we go over every day.
Oh, okay. Yeah, see, so it's not so crazy. So, but here's the thing. Even if at the end of I engage in some kind of detailed reflection, I'm like, you know what? This table is just a figment of my imagination, as are all of you, and I'm in the matrix right now. I don't really see myself living my life any differently in the grand scheme of things. So it might be the case that debates on philosophy of religion become more like that. There's still going to be questions of philosophical interest that people will care about, but yeah, they won't have if apatheism were true, then presumably they're not going to have that direct connection, to, if it turns out, morally speaking, that Peter Singer was right about his views on famine and our duties to give to charity, then if you put that into practice, then that's going to have a really, really substantial conclusion, and individually that might really affect how you live your life, how you dispose of your income, and so on. But if apatheism is true, then what your actual answers to existence questions are just going to be sort of, irrelevant. You're going to continue to live your life in roughly the same way, regardless. There might be some changes. So if you were really involved in a church and then you later come to think that God doesn't exist, maybe you leave that church or are less involved. But that, from an atheist point of view, that's not going to be that much different from oh, you were really, really into the NFL once, and now you're into NBA basketball or something like that. So maybe you engage in you don't do fantasy football anymore, and so you don't hang out with those friends anymore, and so on. But that's clearly not the same level of significance that most people think our religious beliefs and answers to existence questions have.
So so you just wouldn't say that you're not going to say that philosophers must do, as you're classifying it, important questions.
No, well,
okay,
right.
Good.
But I will say that I think that it's possible that if apatheism were true, then it may be the case that in focusing so much on existence questions, there are other important questions in philosophy of religion that have been neglected, and so those might get more attention. But that's very speculative. I don't really know. And I also guarantee you, there's no way that philosophers will suddenly magically come to a consensus that apatheism is true. So this isn't a worry for any time in the near future. Let's go to this side of the room, and then I'll do.
Yeah, so going back to your taking it out from elimination,
Right.
The one about the life meaning, I guess the others kind of made sense to me, but I was struggling with that one because I was just trying to think in terms of something that could be accepted for multiple people.
Like a criterion of what constitutes a meaningful life?
Well, right, because I'm thinking, if we accept the scientific reality that in the end our sun will get bigger, explode, and the Earth will no longer exist. Humanity will end at some point unless we get into another philosophy.
Right.
Then I can see where you could say, okay, even the people who are feeding starving children, their lives were still meaningful. But what about the person who is a history professor and is investigating the Victorian period in England? Or what about the person who spends their life as a banker? How, for the average person who is not a missionary feeding starving children in Africa, how is their life going to hold meaning without a metaphysical afterlife?
Yes, let's use your example of the history, was it teacher?
History
Scholar.
professor. Scholar.
Okay, history professor, studying Victorian era stuff, right? Presumably, that history professor is making contributions to an ongoing dialogue, right, in the historical literature. They're probably interacting, they're probably teaching, interacting with other people who are interested in this stuff and enhancing their knowledge and so on. An orthodox view in epistemology is that knowledge is just valuable for its own sake, independent of anything else. So one might, epistemic goods might just be one example. There are just certain parts of our existence that are just intrinsically valuable for their own sake. And so when we engage in activities that promote those values, they're going to be valuable regardless of, any metaphysical picture. But I would say you don't even have to necessarily posit that picture. I would think that, just imagine a history professor suddenly becoming an atheist and just thinking, wow, like everything I've done, all this historical stuff, this research I've done, these debates I've advanced, are just meaningless now. That just doesn't strike me as being the conclusion that one would draw. You certainly might perceive your life in a different way, and you might structure your life projects differently, but it seems like bettering, the lives of your students, teaching well, advancing these debates. I mean, sure, there may come a time when humanity is wiped out of existence, but presumably the people that benefited from that scholar's research up to that point, those benefits, I don't think those benefits just disappear, or that their appreciation for the scholar's work will disappear, even if the human species existence is finite. Does that speak to you? And this is just one example that we're working through. So
that was helpful. I guess I still struggle with, to me, the pursuit of knowledge and those things are meaningless if humanity ceases to exist at some point. But that could just be my own perspective, so that's fine.
Well, so what about I should probably jump to someone else, but
Yeah.
let's continue after the.
Well, this is a little different than what I was going to start off with, but you just said the history teacher scholar has an intrinsic value in the history that they're learning. So then I would ask, why is there intrinsic value in whether God exists or not? That's just a little side note. I want to talk mainly about your refutation argument number 5, the neutral one, in which you question the importance of answering existence questions. I'm also in Dr. Rivera's skepticism class, and today we went over Robert Nozick's argument, the experience machine. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I am.
It's like, basically, you have the option to continue living life as it is, or you can plug into this machine and alter your existence however you want. It's going to be the exact same thing as your life right now, but you can control your experiences. So you can have as much pleasure as you want. You can have whatever situation, even if you alter slightly, like make yourself 1 inch taller or something like that. An ideal world. And he asked this question to a lot of people, and the majority of people, including myself, don't want to plug in this machine, right? But why don't they want to plug in this machine? It seems that there's something that's important other than just happiness. There is this importance that we have in us about whether there is some truth, some objective truth. It seems just fundamentally essential that we're not just living in this matrix. If we can choose whether to live in the matrix, we're not going to. Well, why? Because we want to know some truth. And I'd say in the same way, there's some just deep fundamental knowledge for us to want to know whether God really exists. And I think that could be an example of importance for what God is.
Yeah. So your minor point at the beginning is might there be some kind of epistemic good attached to knowing whether or not God exists? Yeah, sure. I mean, there might be, but I don't think an atheist would be necessarily really bothered by that fact, because they would just say, yeah, well, I mean, it's also, there's some epistemic goodness attached to knowing how many dust motes are on your desk, right? There's some level of epistemic goodness that might be attached to any true belief about any proposition or any knowledge about any proposition. But that doesn't show that there's anything uniquely valuable about God's existence separating it from this other stuff. Now, to the experience machine, I've found that people's intuitions about that just radically differ in the people I've talked to about it. My own view is, what I want to know is, how good is my life prior to plugging in? And if my life's really crappy, if I'm starving to death in a third world country, hook me up right now. Just getting in there. But if I have, as I think I do now, a reasonably good life, I would rather have a reasonably good life in the actual world as opposed to even a great life in a non-actual world, even if I didn't know otherwise. But I don't know if this is what people's intuitive judgments about these sorts of cases are. Now, as to whether we have like sort of just a general intellectual curiosity to know, to try to learn these sorts of, whether we in fact, are a product of God's design or whether it was created by a cosmic coincidence or so on. I'm not sure how, I think there are certainly lots of people who are motivated in that sort of way, but it is worth pointing out that as just a fact of human psychology, there are lots of people that for various non-philosophical reasons are drawn to, an atheistic view. So there are some people who just don't share that intellectual curiosity. Whether that's like a defect of their character or not is kind of an issue for another day. But,
So I guess you're just not convinced by the majority of people would not plug in the machine. You're saying there might be like half and half, like half the people plug in and half the people don't. Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. I've had classes where more students will plug in than not. I've had classes where almost no one will plug in. So I just don't know what conclusion to draw from that as a matter of like human psychology. You know what I mean? I'm not sure what, especially because like there's a big movement now called experimental philosophy, which is more about like philosophical. I think it's more like philosophical psychology, but they'll do tests to like examine the reliability of people's intuitions with respect to these kinds of thought experiments. And one of the central findings from a lot of these studies, I don't know how, I'm not great at evaluating psychological research per se, so I don't want to say that they're all great, but one of the central findings is they find that people's intuitions about these cases can be manipulated by a variety of factors that have nothing to do with the case itself. So like how the case is presented, what language is used, what mood they're in prior to asking the question and things like that. They're vulnerable to all kinds of psychological distortions. So I just have no idea what data to take from a thought experiment like Node6 experience machine. I think you very well might be right that there is like some kind of epistemic value tied to existence questions. But I think an atheist will just say, sure, there might be, and it's probably going to be true for everything. But that's not really an issue for me. What I'm concerned about is showing that there's nothing special about existence questions, and we shouldn't be any more concerned with those sorts of things than with a variety of other true beliefs in a number of other different areas.
It struck me as you were developing the argument from elimination and also the divine hedonist argument that how many of the things you say are basically exactly what atheists say in response to those points, and also the argument from hedonists, to make it out, even to get to that point number 3, that if God exists, it must be terribly important whether we believe in it. To even make that out, to fill it out, because 3 doesn't logically follow from 1 and 2. You would need more premises to flesh it out to make it a valid argument. And those other premises, I can fairly well guess what they are, but they are basically the same premises that atheists would accept to make out the argument from divine hedonists to prove that God doesn't exist, or that at least a loving God or a perfectly moral God doesn't exist. It made me think that the kind of philosophical apatheism that you're advocating is really, it's just atheists who don't care. That they're just atheists. It's essentially a position that has ideologically is almost coextensive with atheism. But we don't really care. We're not going to draw the final inference that the atheists do. We just don't care what the ultimate result of these premises are. But you accept the same premises. But you must do it in order to rebut the points that people usually give about meaning to life without God, not creating a planet. But you make the argument from divine hedonists. You commit virtually coextensive claims with atheism. And so it just seemed like this is probably the reason why apatheism isn't really discussed more in the literature, is because it's just atheism from a certain posture of don't care about the question.
So why would the points that I put up rule out like deism, belief in an impersonal God?
They may not rule out deism, but just as a matter of the way it's actually done in philosophical discussions today, the divine hedonist argument, the deists aren't offering that argument. And atheists running around making it. And there may be some points I think that deists wouldn't hate or deists wouldn't accept, maybe, but anyway, just.
Yeah, well, so I'd like to talk more about this. I definitely think that the following is true. Apatheism rules out a large class of different kinds of theisms because, especially because of the afterlife related stuff. I mean, lots of stuff is going to fall off the table, just based on that claim alone. But I'm not sure if everything that an atheist says is coextensive with what an atheist would say. So I have a friend, for example, who identifies as being Jewish. He's 25. He has not been to temple since he was 15, so that's 10 years. When I asked him about this recently, I'm like, well, do you still believe in God? Well, I said, yeah, it's all fine, but I don't understand how these people have time to go to church. I got things to do. Sounds to me exactly like what an atheist would say. And I try to think, like, is there anything in like what I presented here that rules out his that kind of a view, like a belief in God, a belief in some kind of a deity, perhaps even certain religious commitments of a sort that's not connected to, the afterlife or centrality of God and grounding in ethic or anything like that. I just don't see any inconsistency between the core claims of atheism and the vaguely theistic commitments that my friend has. And I know McKim himself couldn't have thought that either, because one of the central conclusions of his book is he's trying to defend like theism plus apatheism, right? So I mean that doesn't mean that look, maybe when we work it out, that turns out to be inconsistent.
Yeah, that's what I suspect, is that these people may not have thought through their whole web of beliefs, and they don't really have a coherent set of beliefs after all. But that would take some time to show up and some further probing of what their beliefs are. Just off the cuff, just from what you said, the things that you said just sound so strongly reminiscent of many typical kinds of atheist points, that just seem like, this is really much more than atheism for some attitude. I mean, I think I could grant the possibility that there's some logical space to create a doctrine of apatheism that's distinct from atheism. I think I would have to concede that. Just as a matter of practical effect, I feel like most people would believe the things you need to believe to be apatheism, always be atheists.
Right. So this might be a sociological explanation for why, when you see apatheism in, like on charts or something, it's always as a subset of non-belief called practical apatheism, and the thought being these are atheists who don't care. One hopes that down the line I can make some inroads toward that. But I do think you highlight one of the really important questions, which is how much space is there for theistic beliefs that are on the table to really get into the picture? I personally think that deism or something similar can easily fit in to this kind of schema. But I admit that it's harder to see how much space there is for theistic worldviews to get in the picture.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have two things. One in relation to Ms. Dunham's question. Aristotle at the beginning of his metaphysics asked the question, why are we concerned with metaphysical questions that are most important, which is what he calls first principles, questions about first principles, does God exist? And he says, we by nature desire to know. And he goes further, he says, we by nature desire to know all that we can know, which, the ultimate of which is the question, answering the question does not exist. So according to Aristotle, it is part of being a human being, part of what it is to be a human being, is to want to know whether or not God exists. So it seems to me apatheism is very anti-Aristotelian at its core. Aristotle is right, and apatheism is wrong.
Yeah.
Right, maybe you guys that. Another thing is, at the beginning of your talk, didn't you say that define apatheism as the position that we should not be concerned with EQ questions?
Prima facie, the attitude that one should adopt about existence questions is one of indifference, at least with respect to like how we answer those questions.
But your elimination argument is designed to show that there is no compelling reason to claim that we should be concerned with EQ questions.
It's just, so this is not like the full version of what the argument would have to be if it were going to be sound,
Yeah.
right? But if it
I think
were,
if it's fullness, it would be that there is no compelling reason.
yeah, there's
You
no
say we should be
there's no compelling reason to reject atheism as formulated, as I just gave it.
So I think the most you can say then is that we need not be concerned with EQ questions. Not that we should not be concerned with EQ questions. But something quite different.
Right. So remember, I had that. I mentioned that one may say after the argument of elimination is complete, this is just a stalemate. They haven't established that we actually should adopt atheism. So that's what. So I think the argument from elimination can't stand alone. It has to be supplemented by some kind of
positive.
some kind of further argument. It's sort of like, think of the argument from hiddenness as being like the supporting argument, and then the argument from elimination is like the responses to objections. That might be a way that you could conceive of it or structure it. As to your first point, I wish it were the case that all human beings just by nature desire to know. But I gather from my undergrad students that some of their efforts in my classes that they don't want to know all there is, about certain things. It is interesting though to consider, like, I hadn't thought about the fact that the view might be anti-Aristotelian in that particular way. I don't know if I have a problem with that or not on off the cuff. So, but I'll make a note of that in the future.
Do you think you can be an apatheist without an opinion one way or the other? And I to sort of specify what I mean is, like, I consider myself to be an agnostic atheist, right? Like, I'm agnostic about what I know. I'm an atheist in opinion. And I almost feel like the moment somebody throws out the question, no matter how much I may care about it, I might take up a position one way or the other, at least leaning towards either the theist side or towards the atheist side. Do you consider that there may be, or is it even possible to have an apatheist who doesn't at least have an opinion? Does that matter? I mean, is that a goal of apatheism, is to not have an opinion on it, or?
I don't think that can be the goal. I'm not sure if you could come to accept atheism without, like, that. It might be, maybe it's philosophically possible, maybe. I think it would be sort of odd, though, because atheism is tied up so much with so many of these other, views about the afterlife, and about the relationship between God and morality, and all this other stuff. I think it would be hard to, like, research that stuff and think about it carefully and not, even if you didn't try to come to some kind of conclusion about, whether, like, where you would hedge your bets with regard to whether or not God exists.
It's kind of like you're going through drive-thru and your friend late at night is like, I don't know if I should get the burger or the nuggets, and you don't particularly care, but you're like, I'd go with the nuggets.
Yeah, very much so. But I don't think that's necessarily the problem. The central, an atheist would just say, well, look, I may have my views one way or the other, but I also don't think that it's really that big a deal whether I turned out to be wrong about them or not, or whether people disagree with me about them.
Maybe two more, and then we'll.
Okay.
Who had their hand raised?
And I think.
Well,
Okay. My question is, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk, actually.
Thank you.
It is something kind of different, I guess, but I'm curious as to whether or not you personally are an apatheist, or are you simply pointing it out? Because I think I have to concede that clearly this has been ignored. It's important to cover it. But is it just an intellectual interest in fixing that problem, or would you say you're personally an atheist at this point, at this juncture?
So part of what I've been trying to, this whole project actually goes back to when I was 20. I had a conversation with the friend I now acknowledged at the beginning, Jordan. Conversation in Lawrence, Kansas, and Old Chicago, and we both went to a private Lutheran school, and we basically both, like, just totally lost our belief in God. And we were talking about it because we had been apart, separate. We went to different high schools. This was just kind of 7 years hence getting out, leaving that school. And what we sort of came to realize is neither of us really felt like atheism, strictly speaking, was an accurate depiction about it. And we sort of realized, like, look, it's not like I've got anything against. Like, I understand the arguments, and I understand that people interpret the evidence differently, and that this leads them to theism, and blah, blah, blah. And I don't really have a huge problem with that, and so on. So then we were both going to go off and do other things. And so he was going to go into political science, and I was going to go into English for graduate studies. Neither one of those trajectories panned out, but well, his did. He got a terminal master's, but now he's back doing psychology stuff. And I wound up going into philosophy, and so, then several years later, I'm like, hey, you remember that thing we talked about? Like, apparently it doesn't exist. Nobody seems to have done any work on this. So what we then tried to figure out was exactly how do we classify our position. And so a lot of the stuff at the beginning is like an attempt to kind of work that out. Like, what exactly is our view?
Okay.
And what commitments do we exactly have to accept to make, to defend this sort of position? So in part, if you're going to say, if the question is just simply, would you identify as an atheist? Probably yes. But I'm still in the process of figuring out what that is.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Have you had any problems with this being viewed as a cop-out, the way agnosticism is viewed by both atheists and religious people as like a cop-out stance?
No, and that's just a silly, I haven't had any problem, but I also think that's just a silly objection. Of course, agnosticism makes sense as a position, but it's worth pointing out, like from the beginning of the presentation, and Brandon identified himself as being an agnostic atheist. You can be agnostic and be a theist or be an atheist. So it's not like I take those kinds of questions to be like, the question would be, what do you most identify as? And someone might say, well, look, if I had to pick a side, maybe I side with the theist or maybe I side with the atheist. But in the end, I really feel like a better representation of my attitude is I just don't think I have any idea what the answer is. I don't think there's anything. I don't think that's a cop-out. I think that's a perfectly respectable intellectual position. But I've never had anybody say atheism is a cop-out. So I hope not to. You never know.
Thanks again for coming.
Yeah, no problem.
Interesting. Are you going to post that video and
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.